class, it's spooky season, and that means witches, pumpkins, skeletons, and all things spooky. I'm gonna do a tutorial to start out how to create a watercolor pumpkin. If you wanna follow along with me, super fun. All you need is a basic watercolor set, some watercolor paper, and obviously a paintbrush and a water cup, and some paper towels, and a good attitude. Oh, of course a good attitude.
Let's get started. To make a nice clean border, if you use tape around the edges with blue tape or use regular masking tape. There's a quick trick you can do to make sure that your tape does not rip your paper. If you stick it to your clothing first, you get those little fibers from your clothing, and then you can put it on your paper, and when you peel it up, it won't tear. Just make sure to press it down so none of the water leaks underneath your tape. Once you have all your supplies, start by sketching very, very lightly your pumpkin or pumpkins. You can do your own style pumpkin, or you can use my pumpkin template that I have available on my website, which is linked down below in the comments. You can download that free from my website. What you can do is you can just hold it up to a window and trace it, or you can just draw it freehand. I'm going to do a big pumpkin and a little pumpkin next to it and a moon. So here's my sketch, and you can see how light it is. And if you follow the link, you can see what the design looks like before I started sketching it. After I'm done sketching, and see how light it is really hard to see, I am going to start with my watercolor, and I'm going to get all my watercolor wet, so you can spray it with water however you want. Once it's all wet, I'm going to start by grabbing a couple of colors, and I'm getting the orange first. I am not using the orange straight out of the palette. I'm actually going to grab a teeny tiny bit of green, and I'm mixing it in with the orange. That's to kind of dull down the orange a little bit. And the reason I'm doing this is to calm those colors down a little bit so they look a little bit more professional and they look like they were mixed by me and not straight out of the palette. This makes artwork that looks a little bit more adult and not so much like you're just playing with a watercolor palette that you got at school. So I'm starting with my pumpkin, and I am just going to follow the curves of those pumpkin lines around the edges. And I'm using lots of water. So do you see how light this is? You can always build up with watercolor. Take your time. I work pretty quickly, but this is because I've been doing this a long time. So take your time, cover things with watercolor, and then step away, let them dry, work on another piece of art, whatever you need to do. And then you can do more layers on top if you need to. So I'm doing this pumpkin, and I'm going to vary my colors a little bit. So I'm making one pumpkin kind of a darker orange, and then I'm going to make my other pumpkin a totally different orange. That's the thing when you're painting. If you vary your colors a little bit, it'll make it more interesting. What do you get if you divide the circumference of a pumpkin by its diameter? Pumpkin pie. Anyway, don't forget to use lots of water. Never be shy using a lot of water. There's a really hard balance between using way too much water and using not enough water, but basically your watercolor should flow. So you should not have a hard time spreading it. It's okay to have light layers of color, and every kind of watercolor is different. So yours might be lighter or darker, and go with what you can do and it'll look great. Let's start on our second pumpkin. The second pumpkin is going to be a little bit more orange, but again, pick your own orange. Pick whatever color you want. I am going to go right up next to that other pumpkin, but I'm not going to let them blend together. Do you see that little white line that's between the two pumpkins? So they're still separated a little bit. You can paint them as one big shape if you want to, but if you want them to be slightly separated, you can leave a little white line, a little white paper in between the two pumpkins. Watercolor is funny because it can touch each other and it will all kind of smear together in one big blob if you're not careful with those edges. So sometimes it's good to just work in layers, take your time, leave some white edges on things, and then go back and paint those edges in later once all of your paint is dry. So we're filling in our other pumpkin, and it's okay if there's all different colors of orange. You can even drop in orange colors into your pumpkin. If it's mottled or spotted or not even, that's okay because that's what real pumpkins look like. I'm now adding the stem, and this is a good example. If you see the stem at the top has started to bleed into the pumpkin a little bit, all you have to do is just dab that with your paper towel or with your towel, and you can stop it from spreading. So again, with the stem, I make the stem, but I'm not touching the pumpkin at all. I'm just going right up to the edge of the pumpkin, and I'm making the stem with green. Now I'm going to let it dry, and you can use a hair dryer for this for about 5 minutes, or you can let it sit for about 20 minutes, but make sure it's nice and dry. All right, I stopped the video for a little while, let it dry, and now I am back. My pumpkins are dry, and I am going to start thinking about the background. I'm going to make a night sky in the background. And if you see in the photo or in the picture that I gave you of the pumpkins with the moon, you can add a moon or you can not add a moon. Totally up to you. I did draw a crescent moon, and those can be kind of hard to draw. So that would be something that you might want to trace, or you could just use like a tape roll or something to make your shape. I'm grabbing blue. I'm grabbing a little bit of pink. I'm grabbing some purple, and I did add a little pink from another watercolor palette just to add that in there. I'm grabbing all the dark colors that I can that are sky colors. So I'm going to make a purple. I'm going to make a blue. Honestly, you can go with any colors that you want here. You just want to make them nice and dark and saturated. So saturated is when you have a lot of color. And what you're going to do is you're going to start filling in your background, but you are going to do it as quickly as possible and use quite a bit of water, but try not to go over the pumpkins if you can help it. If you don't paint over the pumpkins, then the pumpkins will be nice and bright in the final painting. If you touch the edges of the pumpkins a little bit, that is okay. And what I'm doing is I'm basically just doing blobs of purple and blue in the background. And the reason I'm doing this so quickly is because I am going to sprinkle the background with salt, and this is the part where we're going to use the salt. So I'm going to sprinkle, and you can just use plain old table salt. And once I'm done painting my background with the colors that I like and really getting it in there with all these crazy blues and purples for the sky, I'm going to sprinkle salt on the parts that I'm done painting. Once I sprinkle the salt on, I don't want to touch it. It should not be painted at all. So I've just sprinkled some salt on here, and I'll show you what it looks like when it dries. It looks really cool when it dries. When you're doing it in the moment, it doesn't look that cool, and you're wonder, why am I doing this? But sprinkling the salt on is going to suck the watercolor out and make it look like a night sky. Now I'm going to make the moon, which I had drawn on there really lightly, but you couldn't see it. I'm just filling that in with yellow paint. So it's going to be nice and bright. And honestly, whatever you do with the sky, as long as you fill it in with some type of color, it will be completely fine. You can make a daytime sky if you want to. You can make a nighttime sky. You can make a round moon. You can make a crescent moon. I'm putting a little bit of green on the bottom just so the pumpkins have somewhere to sit. And I've made kind of a toned down green. What I did is I harmonized the colors by taking just a tiny bit of that orange and putting it in with the green. And when you do that, you grab that opposite color that you already used in the pumpkins, you harmonize the colors so they all look good together. So adding a little bit of green for the grass. And I am just going to continue to make the green for the, you know what? I'm adding that into the top as well. So I'm narrating this after the fact because it was really loud in the room when I was painting this. This is the part where you really want to take your time. As I'm kind of waiting for one part of the sky to dry, I might go back in and add a few details. So now that my pumpkins are dry, I can go in with my darker orange and I can add that shadow because that big pumpkin is behind the little pumpkin. So now I'm just kind of adding some darker orange to show those lines in the pumpkin. And I'm adding the bottom where there's a little shadow where it's sitting. Just some details. If you have a real pumpkin to look at, you can always do it, or you can just make it up. It's kind of meant to be cartoon, so don't worry about making it perfect. Same with this guy. I'm just adding some of those little pumpkin lines. You can even carve it out and add a face to it if you want to. Make it your own style. And work your way around your whole painting. I'm going to go back in here and work on the sky now that my moon is a little bit dry. It's not completely dry, but I feel confident that I can go right up to the edge of it without letting it bleed in. And if it does, I can just wipe it up with a paper towel. Totally fine. Watercolor is meant to be loose and free, so just have fun with it. I'm adding some purple and some blue, and I'm just kind of getting in there with the sky. I do want to paint this pretty quickly because I'm going to put the salt on it, and as it dries, the salt will give it a really cool texture. Add some dark into it too. And don't be afraid to put down water on the paper first and then add more paint if you want to. You can just grab straight water to blend it out. You don't have to get any more paint if you've got a lot of pigment on there. Just grab some water and smear it all around. Now I'm going to start adding the salt. I am just using sea salt. You can use any kind of salt. You can use iodized salt, sea salt, whatever. I'm kind of making the edges of my moon look a little bit better though. I wouldn't paint it after you put the salt on it. I'm breaking the rules. And then once you add the salt, you need to let it dry completely. And sometimes it takes a really long time. So you might have to let it sit for like a half hour, 20 minutes. I like to use a hair dryer. Once the paint is not so wet that it's going to blow all over the place, then I use a hair dryer. So I'm going to go do that and I'll be back. It's dry now. This is what the salt looks like when it dries on the watercolor. Doesn't that look cool? You are going to want to brush your salt off. Don't leave it on there. Brush it into the garbage. And now we're going to add some details. If you are done, you can stop right here. You can be done. But if you have pencils, colored pencils, or watercolor pencils, I'm going to show you a couple things you can do on top of this to make it look even cooler. One option is to use a black pen and go over it and add details, but what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to use watercolor pencils, and you could do this with regular colored pencils too. I'll show you what it would look like before using the water on it, and just get in there and sharpen it up and add some details. So I'm using a darker orange just to bring out the lines on the pumpkin, and this is a watercolor pencil, and honestly, Crayola watercolor pencils are great. I recommend them. They're perfectly fine, and you can add some shading in there if you want to. There are so many things. If you go over this with multimedia or adding, other stuff onto it, it looks really cool. So either shade over it with regular colored pencils or draw over it with a marker or a pen, whatever you want. Add some detail, and it will look awesome. I'll just speed this up a little bit so you can see what I did with the colored pencil. And again, if you wanted to just use regular colored pencils over this and just leave it, that would make an awesome drawing. Or just use a black pen and go over everything for kind of a detailed look, or just doodle over top of it, and it looks really cool. What I'm going to be doing with this is I'm going to be going over it with these watercolor pencils with all different colors that are matching the colors that I painted with, and then I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm just going to softly go over the details that I added, and it'll add a little bit of dimension to my painting. You can define the grass a little bit at the bottom by adding some blades of grass, and it actually gives it kind of more of a 3D look. And then the fun part about watercolor pencils is using your brush and going over these. And the lines stay a little bit, so they're a little bit more defined than regular watercolors, but they also smear a little bit too. So it's kind of fun. It just adds this like bright pop of color. And when you think you're done, you're done. Don't worry about it being perfect. Remember that you're just doing this for fun, and have a wonderful fall and Halloween. And I hope you had fun painting these pumpkins.